And joining us now on the debate in Riverside, California, Perry Link. He is Chancellorial Chair at the University of California at Riverside. In Atlanta, Georgia, Fei Ling Wang, Professor of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. In New York, New York, Guobin Yang, Professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Cultures at Columbia University's Barnard College. And with us here in studio, Bernie Froelich, Senior Fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. Great to welcome everybody. Bernie, you again. Nice to see you again, and all of our guests and points beyond, to a program we're calling Why is China Nervous? And a little background, of course, just to set up our discussion here. Authoritarian regimes, of course, have been falling in Tunisia and Egypt and are under attack in Libya and Yemen. And in response, China has started cracking down on political dissidents and foreign journalists. There have been calls put out online for protesters to gather in China. And Perry, to you first on this. How have Chinese citizens responded to those calls for protest?
Well, most Chinese citizens don't know much about it. The ones who do know about it have come to the streets and gathered in places, sometimes quasi-surreptitiously in the sense that they keep moving, they look at each other. The police control is so tight that at some of those first occasions there were more police than there were demonstrators, and probably more journalists than there were demonstrators either. So it's not by any means a mass movement of the kind that we saw in late 1980s, 1989.
You say they don't know much about it. Why don't they know much about it?
Well, the state media, of course, try to keep this under wraps. So the ones who do know about it are the ones that learn it on the internet, and the uncontrolled part of the internet, that is the ones who can jump the great firewall of control. And there are a lot of them, and they're activists, and they know what they're doing, and so on. But you have to remember, in China, numbers in the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands is still 0.01 part of the population. So when I say most don't, I mean the ordinary Chinese farmers and workers in most places don't know what's going on. That doesn't mean they're happy with their government and that they don't have grievances. They do, and they're all over the place. And the big fear of the government, you began by asking what makes the Chinese government nervous, is, in my view, the fear that this intellectual level ferment that goes on in declarations and so on will hook up with the popular level of discontent.
Fei Ling Wang, why don't you follow up on that? What do you think makes the Chinese government nervous when it sees what else is going on in the world today?
Okay, I think Perry is right, because most Chinese people really don't know much about the cause for demonstrations, nicknamed Jasmine Revolution or Jasmine Walking, whatever, because the Chinese government exercises very tight control of the internet, and the official media has almost no mentioning of those calls. And the reason why the Chinese government seems to be very nervous and seems to be overreacting to this is what I see as a deep incompatibility between the Chinese current political system and the very much changed economy and society. In other words, the political system remained unchanged for decades, whereas the Chinese economy has been growing very rapidly, the society and culture has been diversifying, and there has been tremendous foreign influences in China as well. And the younger generation of Chinese people have new aspirations and new demands that are simply not met properly. And finally, the kind of old, outdated, but very ruthless, very powerful political governing structure is generating lots of injustice, unfairness, and simple, brutal mistreatment of people. So therefore, you see the rise of social tensions and conflicts. And the poor thing is, very bad, sad thing is, the Chinese government seems to know nothing better to govern than, say, using the old techniques of suppression and control. So that explains why they are very nervous, because they're nervous, they know they're sitting on so much grievances right now.
Let's go to New York City and get some reaction from Guobin Yang on this. Do you think, as well, the Chinese government has overreacted to what it's seen elsewhere in the world?
Well, in a sense, I'm not surprised by the government's reaction because, the government doesn't want a revolution, doesn't want to have an unstable society. And the lessons in the Middle East certainly are clear to the Chinese government. But in addition to the Middle Eastern lessons, there are also historical lessons in China. 1989 certainly is the recent example, and further back, the Cultural Revolution. I think it also shows that the Chinese government has come to have more sophisticated understanding of the processes of social movements and popular protest. We know that there are numerous of them happening every day in China, but the government has developed sophisticated ways of managing these protest activities. And I think there is an understanding among the public security authorities that even little activities, little protests can unexpectedly erupt into large-scale movements. And that, I think, was also what happened in 1989. I don't think the Chinese government at that time anticipated the kind of large-scale movement that eventually it turned into. So I think in that sense, currently, the Chinese government's reaction toward what's been happening is not surprising. It's based on a more sophisticated understanding of the situation, and certainly very strong desire to keep the unrest under control.
We've had a couple of references already to 1989, and we should just let our younger viewers know. We have many younger viewers. We also have many new Canadians who are viewers. That, of course, is a reference to Tiananmen Square, the events of June the 4th, when thousands of people were killed in what looked like a budding democracy movement at the time. Bernie, give me your sense of how you think the government's reacted to what's gone on elsewhere in the world.
I think the government has done exactly what I would have thought it was going to do right now. It's tighten up the screws, prevent any demonstrations from collecting any large numbers of people, isolate the foreign correspondents from, keep them out of the picture, avoid the media images from circulating widely.
They've done more than that, though. They've roughed up some journalists as well.
They've also beaten up journalists and trying to just have damage control, to keep everything contained within a small area so that people who are just curious, because remember, the Egyptian thing began with a demonstration, but a lot of it was people who were curious, and they came, and then the curious suddenly, nothing's going to happen, the regime isn't punishing us. Then more and more people collected, and Tiananmen was the same thing too. It escalated. So I think what the government is trying to do in China is just keep this thing from escalating, keep it from spreading, and I think they have right now all the equipment and means at their disposal to do it. I don't think China, Beijing, Shanghai is similar to Cairo and to Tunisia at all.
Well, one of the things Fei-Ling Wang did, he wrote in the New York Times a little while ago a piece in which you said, Fei-Ling Wang, that preventative detention was being put into place right now in China. Who's being detained and how come?
Right. Well, so far we don't really know exactly how many people who are detained, but the ones we know seem to be those kind of dissenting voices, the blog writers, the kind of liberal independent writers, and some lawyers who have been fighting for the rights of ordinary citizens against local officials, against certain government agencies, and also we know that some internet-based kind of community organizers, if you will, or essay writers have been detained. And some say the people who have been detained preventively this time are already reaching about 100 people or even more. And that also explains why not many Chinese people know what's happening right now. And I think the Chinese government has almost a well planned out recipe to deal with this kind of situation. So in the short run, I think this works. It seems to be very effective to put down possible kind of escalating kind of demonstrations. But in the long run, this is going to be utterly very expensive and could be kind of exhausting to the government and to society as well. So every time people put on kind of anonymous note on the internet calling for some gathering, that's going to cause such a full-scale response. And that's really unsustainable in the long run.
Perry, let me follow up with you since we've had a couple of references to Tiananmen Square already. Do you see any comparisons, anything analogous today happening that you think could lead to a kind of Tiananmen gathering where you've got literally thousands and thousands of people gathering in the square?
The big difference between the late 1980s at Tiananmen Square is that the mainstream of the protesters there were students. backed by intellectuals and with workers, urban people mostly looking on, not just in Beijing, but in virtually every provincial capital in China. Now, though, the students aren't at the forefront of this. The students are doing better. The intellectuals are more comfortable in general. They don't feel the grievances that they felt then. They don't especially feel, as they did in the 80s, that this party structure is holding us back. A lot of them live better, can travel better, can publish what they want as long as they don't cross certain red lines and so on. So I don't think it's parallel in that sense. However, I think we should be careful in saying, as all four of us have said, and I'll say it again, that this is very small and isolated and most people don't know about it. If only that were the case, the government would not be nervous. The reason they're nervous, in my view, is that there's broad discontent in China among farmers who've had their land taken away, among laid-off workers, among people who see the environment deteriorating terribly and can't do anything about it. There's hundreds of thousands of what are called petitioners who come and try to air their grievances. And the government in recent years has an ever-increasing budget. Just a few days ago, they announced the new budget of what they call Weiwan, which is preserving stability, literally, expenses. It means everything from internet police to plainclothes police to people who watch professors and religious activists and others and nip things in the bud before they get going. And that budget is huge. Just a few days ago, it passed the national defense budget, which is has been the largest item. So there's a bottom of the iceberg here that's very, very big. And I'll say again, the reason I think they're nervous is that they're afraid that this intellectual ferment, this Jasmine Revolution kind of declaration, will somehow articulate with that and hook up with that. A few months ago, a couple of years ago, Chinese intellectuals wrote something they called Charter 08, laying out a blueprint of how they'd like to see a democracy, a constitutional government, and so on. And that, too, was bottled up in all of the official media. But if the ideas in a document like that could spread to the vast numbers of people who are upset about all kinds of other things, then the government would really have a volcano of a problem on its hands, and it knows that.
In the midst of that answer, Perry, you did refer to the internet, and I want to follow up with Guo Binyang on that, because of course we've been hearing that social media had a huge influence in the events that took place in Tunisia, not so much Libya, but certainly in Egypt. And I'm wondering if it is playing or has the opportunity to play a similar role in China today.
Well, I think that's another reason why the Chinese government reaction is quite radical, because the use of the internet for social activism in China has been taking place for over a decade. It's really started as soon as the internet became popularized in China in the late 1990s. And there have been numerous cases of protest activities online. And therefore, the Chinese government is very, very aware of the potential power of the internet. Now, another aspect of this whole problem is that, as Professor Perry Link just mentioned, in the earlier times, in 1989, the mainstream of the protesters were the intellectuals and students. Currently, we have a more diverse population of people who are, who have all kinds of resentment and grievances. We have workers, we have villagers, we have middle class, homeowners, but their activism is isolated. There's no possibility, very little possibility for building coalitions and broad-based coalitions across regions. And the power of the internet is that it has the potential to bring people together, bring people in different social groups together, and I think that's another reason why there is such a kind of reaction from the point of view of the state.
The internet, I think, in China has served as a powerful alternative to the government-controlled official media. In that sense, the internet, especially to the internet-savvy young people, has served as a useful way to distribute information, to make calls, and to sort of share opinions. So that's why I agree internet is becoming increasingly important. So therefore, the government has spent a lot of money to try to control the internet. Much of the stabilization budget is actually for internet control.
Let me move to the next segment of our discussion, which we're going to headline Fair to Compare, because of course when all the North Africa / Middle East uprisings were taking place, there were a lot of people who were trying to make comparisons to the Eastern Bloc countries back in the 1980s and 90s. And now, I guess some people are trying to make comparisons, Bernie, to you first on this, with what's happening in the Middle East to whether or not it could happen in China as well. Do you see similarities of conditions in which people are living in China today that resemble anything in the Middle East, and therefore you can draw some lines between the two?
Well, I think the one similarity is that they both live in authoritarian political systems, and in the case of Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, there was a reaction finally against that. But there are a lot of differences. When you look at what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, you're talking about over 50% of the population under 30, maybe even under 25, unemployed youth, many of them angry, frustrated, looking for some change. China doesn't have that. China's youth, young people is beginning to shrink in terms of the total population because of the one-child policy. The youth, as Perry Link mentioned, seem to be well taken care of these days, having a potential for jobs, travel, things that their parents never had. So that's out of the picture. Then you have regimes that for 30 years or more were run by dictators, one person. Whatever we think about the Communist Party in China, that it is an authoritarian system, it's been in power for 60 years, it does keep changing its leadership. It does keep trying to navigate through all the crises, all the problems that it's facing, trying to change, to train its people, to fight against corruption here or there. Yes, it still is in control and runs the political system, but it's not perceived, I think, by people in China in the same way that Mubarak was perceived, or perhaps Gaddafi is perceived. And there are other differences as well.
Hold that, though. I want to follow up on that distinction, because that's interesting. Yes, both authoritarian countries, but Perry Link, tell me, do you agree with Bernie that because the Chinese leadership renews itself and changes itself, it isn't one guy on the throne for 40 straight years, that the same kind of widespread disaffection doesn't exist in China regarding the political leadership?
Fundamentally, I agree, yes. I think that when the Middle Eastern countries focused on Mubarak or Gaddafi, the animus that they feel has a personal focus, in a sense that it doesn't in China, not only because the leadership is more diffuse, it's a dozen or so men who operate behind a black box and march across the stage like penguins. It's hard to tell any kind of personality in any of them. And I also think the Chinese populace, probably less than the protesters in the Middle East, doesn't even ask themselves the question, do I want to overthrow this dictatorship or not? It's too hard to do. They are preoccupied with the daily struggles in their own environments, and when they get angry, it's about local leaders who are bullying them, and sometimes the petitioners I mentioned a moment ago assume, naively of course, but they assume that they can go above the local leaders and find justice at higher levels and so on. So it's a much more diffuse, that doesn't mean it's not effective. It blankets the system with control, and this huge maintenance of stability budget does that in every possible way, nipping trouble before it starts and so on. But yeah, I agree with Bernie that it's not as personalized in its focus on the very top leader.
And you said something there, Perry, that I want to follow up with Fei-Ling Wang on, and maybe perhaps appropriately on this International Women's Day. A dozen men who march like penguins, you said. Are there no women in any high places in the Chinese government?
That's a good question. In the top echelons of the Chinese government now, there are only very few women there, and none of them is in the top level, at the sort of a 9 or 10 people level. The highest ranked Chinese woman right now is only kind of counselor of the state council, Liu Yandong, who happened to be a member of the Politburo, but not a member of the standing committee of the Politburo, which is really in charge. So therefore, women is clearly underrepresented at the top level. In addition to what Bernie and Perry have nicely said, I think there are some other important differences between China and the Middle East need our attention. And one is the Chinese government is much stronger than both Egyptian and Tunisian government, or even Libyan government, in the sense that the Chinese government is very rich, controls a large amount of resources, and have absolute control of the military, unlike in the case of Egypt. In the case of Egypt, the Egyptian military had a very good relationship with the United States, for example, and that relationship proved to be pretty important in turning the Egyptian military to a certain extent, where in this case, the Chinese military is totally under the control of the party, and there's no visible foreign connections with that military. And secondly, the Chinese military is doing, Chinese economy is doing so well, and many Chinese elites, especially kind of a well-educated elites, are feeling the hope, and they have material stakes in the system, and they may have grievances and have complaints, but they don't see a future as so dark as those unemployed Tunisian college graduates. And finally, the Chinese rising nationalism is becoming very powerful and capturing many people's attention and their energy. So many Chinese youth on the ground of a nationalistic and patriotic grounds, they would actually be very hesitant to sort of overthrow the government. And the point about there's no single man as a target is very well taken, because right now we don't really hear any focused calling for overthrowing the CCP or any top leaders. We just have a widespread existence of grievances and complaints. That seems to be enough already to make the top leaders nervous.
And Guobing Yang, let me follow up with you on this. I know many people have pointed out when they saw the pictures on CNN, for example, of those who were leading the demonstrations in the streets in the Middle East. Many of them were women. Many of them were secular women. Many of them were religious women. Can you tell us, again, as we look at comparisons between the Middle East and what's going on in China, can we say that women are, as clearly they're not involved in government in the same way they are elsewhere in the world, but are they the leaders in the dissident movement in China? Women, that is.
Well, I think even in dissident movement, it's still men who are the majority of the the voices. Although there are some women who have large followings as well on Twitter and on Chinese microblogs, and they are influential. There are several of them, I think. So that's one thing. The men still dominate the dissident scene. But I want to add one point to our discussion so far in terms of differences and similarities between Middle East and China, which is that in addition to all the other factors that have been mentioned, there's another difference that China at present doesn't have a strong ideology that brings together the opposition. Now, Fei-Ling mentions nationalism, and there are other there's Confucianism now. There are other ideologies which are now being promoted to unite the population. But when it comes to political opposition, I don't think there is a strong ideology that brings the opposition together. In Egypt, for instance, religious ideologies, religious beliefs, religious institutions actually have very powerful sort of influence on the mobilization. But we don't see this kind of social, ideological basis in China. That's, I think, another crucial difference.
Bernie, let me follow up with this. I think much of the complaints we see in China today focus on how corrupt some of their officials are, how unjust much of society is. How well are Chinese citizens able to address these grievances within the current political system?
Well, first of all, just one point about what Guobin just said, and then I'll come to that. China, in a way, is an economy looking for an ideology, looking for values now. I think this is the problem. So you can't talk of social movements suddenly developing in China. It's all fragmented. And until they can come up with something that replaces the socialism that's basically not there anymore and eats away at the materialism that can only go so far, they're going to have a problem. Now, the question again, sorry.
Not at all, but complaints about corruption, complaints about injustice, how able are Chinese citizens to have these concerns addressed within the official system?
I think they're not very able to have these complaints addressed. I think this is one of the big frustrations that's building up. At the local level, there are real problems when corrupt officials and developers gang up on peasants and grab their land, and you have a lot of spontaneous demonstrations against this and this corruption, not organized beyond one locality. That's the big difference here. I know a lot of my friends in China talk about the corruption, and much more now than they did 5 years ago, and talk about corruption not just at the local level, but among officials now.
So it's worse today?
They would say so, but they may be middle-class people who are striving to increase their position and come up against officials and people who now use their wealth to gain privilege through corruption.
Got it. Fei Ling Wang, you want to address that?
Yeah, I agree. I think Bernie is right. And so far, the complaints and the grievances against corruption, against government abuses, is largely segmented, decentralized, and some of them actually have been addressed if you can make a big enough noise. So there comes the role of the internet. Some cases have shown to be catching the government's attention because it has made they have made a big noise on the internet. But by far, the most cases of corruption and abuse of the power are not sufficiently addressed. So that contributed to what they called a general feeling of social decay. A famous professor at Tsinghua University, one of the top schools in China, recently wrote that the Chinese society is facing a serious danger of decaying over time. In other words, uncontrolled corruption, uncontrolled cynicism, and uncontrolled kind of fakery of many, many things. It's a social general decay rather than a kind of a uprising, because the government is so strong. There's no united opposition, and the grievances are so disorganized, yet everybody seems to be into this corruption game. So a social decay is a real danger down the road.
But Perry Link, speak to this, because we've heard numerous guests on this program say in the past that the economy is so firing on all cylinders so well and has been lifting so many people out of poverty that has managed to, I guess, keep people's political desires, relatively speaking, in check. And there hasn't been, an overwhelming desire, obviously, to go out into the streets in the tens of millions to protest. Do you agree with that?
Well, the economy boom's factor in all of that, yes, is to keep people happy so that they're distracted from other problems. But I think all of us have been saying that the rising tide of grievances is catching up with that. The one extra piece I'd like to put in there, although Yang Guobin actually put it in a moment ago, is the internet. Yes, it's diffuse. Yes, it's unorganized. Yes, any organizer who comes along is squelched. But the internet is the one way that's changing. The Nobel Prize winner Liu Xiaobo called the internet God's gift to China because it allows people to organize in virtual space, not in physical space where plainclothes policemen can't come and knock them apart because they're gathering online, as it were. And sometimes this has considerable power. I'm sure my other three panelists know, but your audience might not, about a famous case a couple of years ago of a young woman who was a pedicurist in a I forgot it was called Floating Cloud Pedicure establishment or something. And then an official came in, a local official who was in charge of economic development in his area, and raped her, or tried to. Threw her down on a couch, and she grabbed a knife and stabbed him and killed him. And then, before the internet, 15 years ago, she would have been dead within a few weeks at most because she would have been accused of murder and convicted. But this story got out on the internet. She was charged with murder. But the outcry on her side, because she had resisted this grasping official, was so strong that it stayed the government's hand. And they eventually changed the charge to less than murder. I forgot what it was, self-defense killing or something like that. And then eventually she was let off because of the internet, because millions of people got on the internet on her side. So that's the one area in which grievance channeling has been able to work, although I agree with all my other panelists that the official ways to address grievances have atrophied and are going nowhere.
Let me hear from Bernie and then Guo Binyang on the power of what the internet can and can't do there.
I was just going to add on the internet, I've been thinking always and really lately that the real revolution in China is the internet, information revolution. This is what's going to change the system. It may not overthrow the party, it's going to fundamentally change the system, and it already is doing that. And I think that that's going to take time. It may not lead to an Egyptian revolution, but it may need to lead to some major changes within China.
But Guo Binyang, obviously it was helpful in the case of this woman. However, if the government insists on censoring what you read and insists on, preventing people from, I guess, gathering in the same way as they did in the Middle East on Facebook or on Twitter, can the internet be as effective in massing people together in China?
Well, it still can, but because people have different ways of bypassing internet censorship and control. We do know that the Chinese government has been tightening control over the internet. For instance, Sina's a major portal site, has a very popular microblog, and with millions of users. At times of crisis, times of social crisis, potential times of protest, the search function of the microblog might be closed. So that certainly reduces the possibility of aggregating, searching for information. But the social network that has been built on the internet is such that it reaches far out of the internet, far out of cyberspace into real life, because people who social network online, in the social network sites, BBS forums, blogs, they also gather offline. They have other means of communicating with one another, and increasingly, because of the use of circumvention technologies, there are roundabout ways of getting information, jumping across the wall, for instance, to access information from Twitter. And a number of savvy internet users, a growing number of savvy internet users are able to do that. So the kind of challenge is there. But I want to go back a little, if I may, to the question that you raised early on about the channels of citizen petition and making complaints, and we have had some good discussions about this. And one thing I want to add, I really want to, I would like to take it even further, in the sense that I would argue that this is the lack of institutionalized and effective channels for citizen complaints and petition is probably the major opportunity for a sort of large-scale social movement. Because of that lack, people have to turn to alternative, non-institutional ways of protesting and fighting, articulating their interest. I've been following what's been happening on the internet very closely, and the case that Professor Perry Link mentioned about Deng Yujiao, the young woman, is one of numerous cases that I've counted, which are almost all about people's resentment about law enforcement authorities. There is no effective legal channels for citizens to articulate their interests, to fight for their interests, and therefore they have to turn to these other means. So that's one thing I would want to emphasize.
About 2 minutes to go. Let me get Fei-Ling Wang on this. Can you imagine, Fei-Ling Wang, if the economy were to falter, could you imagine seeing Egyptian-style protests in the streets in China?
If the Chinese economy hit the wall, so to speak, have a big trouble, we're not talking about a recession or depression. If the Chinese economy grows at a speed lower than 4%, according to government statistics, then we're going to see some real trouble happening in China. So that's when you probably are going to see some more similar social problems in China, or disturbances, or instability in China. And all those things we have already mentioned, the role of the internet, the government losing battle of controlling the internet, because it's like a mouse and cat game in controlling the internet and versus the internet savvy people. And also the widespread, disorganized but widespread social grievances will all come together. And that's going to be a decisive moment to see some real kind of social problem. Right now, the economy is doing well, so the government overwhelming force applied is going to be very effective in terms of preventing any big disturbances. But down the road, if the economy falters, and or if some foreign ventures failed, so therefore the face of China is hurt. Therefore, many nationalistic youth will get really, really angry. Those things could really happen, or some kind of unforeseen division among top leadership.
Let me just save 20 seconds here. Forgive me for
Sure.
Bernie, on the same question. If the growth rates come down, they're 8, 9, 10% now. If they have, or worse, there's a possibility for big demonstrations in China?
It's possible. They're predicting 7% now for the next year, which is already a drop. I'm a little more optimistic. I don't see a tremendous drop in the Chinese economy coming up in the immediate future. I think in the long term, in the next decade, you're going to have some major crises, but I don't see in the next 2-3 years that this is going to happen. But I agree that the trade-off, the main trade-off is economic growth. You give us the economic growth, and we'll support you in the government.
Okay. I want to thank all of our guests for appearing on tonight's program. Perry Link at the University of California, Riverside, Fei-Ling Wang, Georgia Tech out of our studio in Atlanta, Guobin Yang from Barnard College at Columbia U in New York City, and of course Bernie Froelich here from both York University and the U of T through the Munk School. Thanks so much, everybody. Great to have you on tonight.